The faint, almost imperceptible crinkle of the laminated page was usually a sound that grounded Lily a tiny anchor in the often overwhelming sea of sensory input that was her world. Today, however, the crinkle was lost, swallowed by a wet, smearing sound, a sound that made Dr. Elena Rostova's stomach clench, even before the smell hit her. It was acrid, unmistakably fecal, a biological insult that wafted on the otherwise pleasant spring breeze, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming lilacs from Mrs. Albright's prize-winning bushes. Lily, her 7-year-old daughter, a creature of delicate sensibilities and incandescent joy when her world was in order, let out a sound that was not a word, but a raw, ragged tear in the fabric of the afternoon. It was a high-pitched keen of utter distress of violation. Her small body perched on the edge of the community sandbox, where she'd been quietly tracing the textured shapes in her precious sensory notebook, recoiled as if struck. Her wide, cornflower blue eyes, usually alight with an almost otherworldly focus, when engaged with her book, were now vast pools of horror and confusion. Elena was across the small park in 3 long strides, her own half-eaten apple dropping unnoticed to the grass. Her heart hammered, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a primal maternal alarm, overriding the years of training that usually kept her calm in the face of far more visible threats. But this in its own way was a threat of visceral, immediate horror. Standing over Lily, a triumphant, almost righteous sneer, twisting her perfectly lipsticked mouth, was Karen Henderson, HOA President Karen, as she liked to be known. In her hand, incongruously gloved in a pristine pink gardening glove, was a plastic doggy-doo bag, clearly holding more of the offending substance. A dark, wet smear, unmistakably feces, now coated the vibrant, carefully constructed pages of Lily's therapy notebook. A lifeline, a tool meticulously designed by her occupational therapist to help her navigate the sharp edges of her sensory processing disorder. There, Karen said, her voice dripping with a grotesque kind of satisfaction, as if she'd just performed a vital community service. She actually gestured towards the befouled book with the bagged excrement. That should do it. A little dose of reality. She needs to toughen up Elena. This constant coddling with special books in quiet corners. It's not how the real world works. Kids need to be exposed to things build resilience. It's just a bit of harmless dog mess. Harmless dog mess, smeared on a child's therapy tool to toughen her up. The sheer breathtaking ignorance, the casual cruelty of it, struck Elena momentarily dumb. Lily was now rocking back and forth, her small hands covering her ears, her wail escalating into a series of choked sobs. The notebook, her sanctuary, lay desecrated at her feet. Elena's mind, a finely tuned instrument honed by years, leading the CDC's Biohazard Emergency Response Program, a fact Karen Henderson and the rest of this idyllic, oblivious suburban enclave knew nothing about, was already screaming. Biohazard, contaminant, pathogens, exposure route, vulnerable host. But overriding the dispassionate professional assessment was a mother's incandescent rage. Karen Elena's voice was low, dangerously calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil within. What in God's name do you think you are doing? Karen blinked, her smugness faltering slightly at Elena's tone, but she quickly recovered. I'm helping Elena, something you parents today seem incapable of. My children were never this sensitive. A bit of dirt never hurt anyone. In fact, it builds character. She gave a pointed look at Lily, who was now almost catatonic with distress. Elena didn't spare Karen another glance. Her focus was Lily. She knelt, her movements swift and sure, gently taking Lily's trembling hands. Lily, sweetie, look at Mommy. It's okay. We'll fix this. Let's go home. We'll get you clean, and we'll take care of your book. Her voice was a soothing balm, but her eyes, as she carefully maneuvered Lily away from the contaminated area, were like chips of glacial ice when they flicked back just for a second to Karen Henderson. Karen simply sniffed, turning to deposit the bagged feces into a nearby park waste bin with an air of someone who had just tidied up a particularly unsightly mess. As Elena led her sobbing, traumatized daughter away, the professional part of her brain was already cataloging feces type: canine likely, vector, direct contact, possible aerosolization of dried particles if not handled correctly, potential pathogens, E. coli, salmonella, Campylobacter, giardia, various parasites. The list was long and ugly, and Karen Henderson, in her profound and arrogant ignorance, had just deliberately exposed a vulnerable child. This wasn't just an act of bullying. This was a biological assault, and Karen Henderson had no idea who or what she had just provoked. Their move to Maple Creek Preserve had been a carefully considered decision, a strategic retreat from the relentless sensory assault of the city. For Lily, the cacophony of urban life had been a daily torment, her world a barrage of too loud sounds, too bright lights, too much everything, that often sent her spiraling into meltdowns, that left her exhausted, and Elena and her husband Mark feeling helpless and heartbroken. Maple Creek, with its tree-lined streets, its promise of quiet, its highly rated elementary school, with a dedicated special needs program, had seemed like a sanctuary, a place where Lily could finally breathe, could find her footing. Elena had downplayed her career, introducing herself simply as Lena Rostova, a researcher with the government's public health department. It was easier that way. The truth, that she was Dr. Elena Rostova, the person who parachuted into the heart of outbreaks, who faced down Ebola anthrax scares and unidentifiable lethal pathogens with a team of highly trained specialists, was not something that translated well at neighborhood barbecues. It invited questions she couldn't answer, a curiosity that felt intrusive. She craved anonymity in her personal life, a quiet space to be just Lena wife to Mark, a steady supportive architect and mother to Lily, their bright, quirky, altogether wondrous child. Lily's sensory notebook was her anchor. Each page was a different texture, a different gentle color, a series of calming images and tactile experiences that Lily could use to self-regulate when the world became too much. It had taken months for her occupational therapist, Dr. Ramirez, to design it with Lily page by precious page. It wasn't just a book. It was an extension of Lily's coping mechanisms, a tangible piece of her hard-won stability. To see it smeared with filth, to witness Lily's visceral reaction to that violation, had ignited a fury in Elena that was cold and deep. Karen Henderson had been a low-level irritant since they'd moved in 6 months prior. President of the Maple Creek Preserve Homeowners Association, she wielded her minor authority like a scepter, her pronouncements on lawn maintenance, garbage can placement, and the approved shades of beige for exterior paint delivered with the gravity of papal decrees. She had two boisterous, seemingly indestructible sons who roamed the neighborhood like a small conquering horde, and she often made pointed remarks about Lily's quietness, her need for routine, her occasional public displays of distress when overwhelmed. Perhaps she just needs more discipline, Karen had once commented to Elena within earshot of Lily, her voice oozing unsolicited advice. A good firm hand is what children respond to. Elena had politely deflected, attributing Lily's needs to just being a sensitive kid, unwilling to medicalize her daughter for neighborhood consumption, fiercely protective of Lily's privacy. Mark had counseled patience. She's just a busybody, Lena. Ignore her. We're here for Lily, for the peace and quiet. Don't let her get under your skin. But this was different. This wasn't a snide comment or a petty enforcement of a ridiculous bylaw. This was a targeted physical act of aggression, a defilement. And it had happened in the one place Lily had begun to feel truly safe outside their own home, the small, well-maintained community park. Back in their own house, the carefully constructed calm shattered. Mark, who had been on a work call in his home office, rushed out at the sound of Lily's continued heart-wrenching sobs. His face went pale, then dark with anger, as Elena quickly, tersely explained what had happened, her voice tight with suppressed emotion as she gently peeled off Lily's soiled clothes at arm's length, her mind automatically running through decontamination protocols. What? Mark's voice was a low growl. With dog feces. On her book, he looked at Lily, who was now huddled in Elena's arms, trembling, her face buried in Elena's shoulder, refusing to look at her own hands or the discarded notebook that lay on a sheet of newspaper Elena had spread on the utility room floor. I'm taking Lily for a bath, a long one, Elena said, her professional demeanor starting to assert itself over the initial wave of maternal fury. Mark, can you carefully bag the notebook, double bag it, please? And her clothes. Don't touch the contaminated areas with your bare hands if you can help it. I need to preserve it as evidence. And then call Dr. Ramirez, explain what happened. Lily will need an emergency session. And call Dr. Chen, her pediatrician. I need to know what tests he recommends given the exposure. Mark nodded, his own face a mask of controlled fury. Evidence, Lena. Are you calling the police? Damn right I am, Elena said, her jaw tight. She assaulted our daughter Mark, with biological waste. The bath was a long, fraught affair. Lily scrubbed at her hands, obsessively, tears streaming down her face, convinced she was still dirty, still contaminated. Elena held her sang. To her tried to project a calm. She didn't feel her mind racing through the potential illnesses, the incubation periods, the subtle early symptoms she'd need to watch for. This was no longer an abstract professional concern. This was her child, her precious, vulnerable Lily. After settling Lily in her room with Mark reading to her, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, Elena made the call to the local police. Officer Miller, no relation, thankfully arrived, a young man who looked barely out of his teens. He listened, patiently took notes, examined the double-bagged notebook from a distance with a faintly disgusted expression. "So, ma'am," he said, clicking his pen, "you're saying Mrs. Henderson, the HOA president, deliberately put dog poop on this book?" "Yes, officer. That is exactly what I'm saying. And she stated her intention was to toughen up my daughter. My daughter has sensory processing disorder. This book is a therapeutic tool. This was a deliberate act of cruelty and a potential health hazard." Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, assault with a dog leavings. That's a new one on me. Technically, it could be battery or maybe malicious mischief, but proving intent for serious harm, that's tricky. Did Mrs. Henderson make any direct threats?" "She stated her intent was to toughen Lily up by exposing her to filth." Eleanor repeated, her voice dangerously level. "That sounds like intent to me. Intent to distress at the very least. And the substance itself is a biohazard." "A biohazard." He looked skeptical. "It's just dog poop, ma'am. Unpleasant, sure, but kids get dirty all the time." Elena felt a surge of frustration so intense it almost choked her. This was the hurdle, the profound, ingrained ignorance about the actual risks. "Officer," she said, trying to keep her tone measured, "canine feces can carry a significant load of pathogenic bacteria and parasites. Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, roundworm, hookworm, giardia. Direct contact, especially with a child who then touches her mouth or eyes, can lead to serious illness. My daughter's immune system is robust, but she is still a child. And this was a deliberate application of that material to an item she handles intimately." He scribbled something in his notebook. "Okay, well, I'll file a report. I'll have to talk to Mrs. Henderson, get her side of the story. Maybe there was some misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Elena wanted to scream. She wanted to grab him by his crisply ironed lapels and explain in excruciating graphic detail exactly what those pathogens could do to a human body, to a child's developing system. She wanted to tell him about her years at the CDC, about the horrors she'd witnessed that began with seemingly innocuous exposures. But she couldn't. She was just Lena Rostova, concerned mother. And her professional credentials, her specialized knowledge, were for now a locked vault. "There was no misunderstanding, officer," she said quietly. "It was a deliberate act, and I expect it to be treated seriously." He nodded, non-committal. "We'll be in touch, ma'am." The rising action began with that dismissive police response, a clear signal that the local system was ill-equipped or unwilling to comprehend the severity of Karen's actions. The next few days were a nightmare. Lily had a severe regression. She refused to touch any of her books, her old sensory toys, anything that reminded her of the incident. She had nightmares, waking up screaming about dirty hands and the brown monster. Her sessions with Dr. Ramirez were intense, focused on trauma recovery. Dr. Chen, her pediatrician, ran a battery of tests for common canine-borne pathogens, the anxious wait for results, adding another layer of stress to Elena and Mark's already frayed nerves. Thankfully, the initial screens came back negative, but Dr. Chen warned that some things had longer incubation periods. They were to monitor Lily closely. Karen Henderson, meanwhile, was on the offensive. When Officer Miller interviewed her, she played the victim, the concerned community leader, shocked by the hysterical overreaction of an overprotective mother. She claimed it was an accident, that she'd been cleaning up a mess in the park, and some of it had accidentally flicked onto Lily's book. She'd even shed a few tears, Officer Miller later relayed to Elena with a touch of sheepishness, about how stressful it was trying to maintain community standards with such sensitive people. Then Karen escalated. She began a subtle but insidious campaign within the neighborhood. At the next HOA board meeting, from which Elena and Mark were conspicuously absent as they were dealing with Lily's latest meltdown, Karen raised the issue of hygiene in community spaces. Without naming names directly, she spoke of certain children with special sensitivities who might inadvertently pose a hygiene risk to others or whose disruptive behaviors were becoming a concern. She proposed new rules restricting the use of the playground and sandbox to children who can adhere to standard community behavioral norms, a thinly veiled attempt to ostracize Lily. Some neighbors, Elena learned later from a sympathetic Mrs. Albright, actually nodded along, swayed by Karen's authoritative tone and her carefully chosen euphemisms. Fear, Elena knew, was a powerful motivator. Fear of germs, fear of the unknown, fear of anyone different. Karen was weaponizing those fears against Lily. The first truly shocking escalation beyond the initial assault came a week later. Lily had a small, colorful sensory swing that Mark had installed in their backyard, a gentle, soothing motion that often helped her calm down. It was visible from the street over their low fence. One morning, they woke to find an official HOA violation notice tacked to their front door. The swing, it declared, was an unapproved permanent recreational structure and violated subsection G of Bylaw 23, pertaining to yard aesthetics and property values. It had to be removed within 48 hours, or they would face daily fines. The swing had been there for months, a source of quiet joy for Lily. No one had ever complained. This was Karen flexing her HOA muscle, a direct retaliation, a clear message that she was in control. She's trying to erase every bit of Lily's comfort, every tool she has. Mark set his voice tight with fury as he ripped the notice from the door. This isn't about a swing, Lena. This is a siege. Elena felt a cold knot of anger tighten in her chest. She's also creating a paper trail, Mark, documenting her harassment. Let her. Inside, her CDC mind was already working, analyzing Karen's tactics, her vulnerabilities. Every action Karen took was another piece of data. The second shocking incident was even more personal, more insidious. Anonymous notes began appearing in their mailbox, tucked inside flyers, or slipped under the newspaper. Cruel, childishly scrawled messages. Keep your weird kid away from normal kids. Maple Creek doesn't want freaks. Learn to control your brat, too. Elena's blood ran cold. This was no longer just Karen's official HOA power. This was someone actively trying to terrorize them to drive them out. Was it Karen herself stooping to this level, or had she incited others, created a permission structure for such hatred? Lily thankfully didn't see the notes. Elena and Mark intercepted them, their hearts aching with each venomous word. The carefully constructed sanctuary of Maple Creek was rapidly becoming a toxic, hostile environment. Lily's anxiety spiked. She started refusing to go into their own backyard, afraid of who might be watching, what new violation they might invent. Elena tried to reason with the HOA board again. She requested a formal meeting, prepared a calm, factual presentation about sensory processing disorder, about the importance of Lily's support tools, about the illegality of targeted harassment. Karen chaired the meeting, her expression a mask of false sympathy. She allowed Elena to speak, then systematically dismantled her arguments with carefully chosen appeals to the greater good of the community, the need for uniform standards, and the unfortunate reality that not all children can be accommodated in all shared spaces. She even hinted that perhaps Maple Creek wasn't the right fit for a family with such specialized needs. Several board members, clearly intimidated by Karen or swayed by her rhetoric, nodded in agreement. Elena left the meeting feeling defeated, unheard, and incandescent, with a rage she had to keep fiercely suppressed. The system was rigged. Karen owned it. The local police were equally unhelpful regarding the notes and the ongoing harassment. No direct threats of violence, Ms. Rostova, Officer Miller explained. Freedom of speech, even if it's nasty. We can't do much unless they trespass or cause actual property damage we can pin on someone specific. It was after that HOA meeting, after another night spent comforting a terrified Lily, who had woken from a nightmare, screaming about the note monster, that Elena reached her breaking point. The local channels were failing. Her daughter was suffering. Karen Henderson was escalating drunk on her petty power, utterly oblivious to the true nature of the forces she was trifling with. The midpoint twist began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, resolute decision made in the sterile silence of Elena's home office late one night, long after Mark and Lily were asleep. Elena sat at her desk, the double-bagged, contaminated sensory notebook on the polished wood in front of her. She had resisted the urge to simply incinerate it, to destroy the disgusting evidence of Karen's cruelty. Now she was glad she hadn't. She thinks this is a game of neighborhood politics of personal dislikes, Elena murmured to the empty room, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She has no concept of contamination control, of pathogen transmission, of the actual tangible harm she has inflicted, and continues to threaten. Feces isn't just dirt, it's a biological agent, and she deployed it against a child. Her resolve hardened. She could no longer afford to be just Lena Rostova, frustrated mother. Lily needed Dr. Elena Rostova, CDC Biohazard Response Lead. From a locked case in the back of her closet, a case that contained specialized equipment she ostensibly used for independent environmental research projects, a cover that satisfied Mark's curiosity and maintained her professional secrecy, she retrieved a sterile biosampling kit, the kind her team used in hot zones: gloves, sterile swabs, transport media vials, chain of custody labels. With meticulous care, her movements precise and economical, honed by years of working in Level 4 labs and field contamination sites, she opened the outer bag containing Lily's notebook. The faint, lingering odor of feces, even after nearly 2 weeks, was still detectable to her trained nose. She documented everything with her phone's camera: the state of the book, the visible smear, the packaging. Then she took multiple swabs from the stained pages, carefully preserving the integrity of each sample. She also took control swabs from an untouched page. She then went outside, under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness. Karen Henderson's prized roses grew near the sidewalk, and Karen, ever the fastidious gardener, had a small decorative waste receptacle nearby for garden clippings and occasionally Fido's bagged contributions. Fido being Karen's yappy, overpampered bichon frise. With a grim satisfaction, Elena, gloved and using sterile forceps, retrieved a recent, still moist dog waste bag that Karen had carelessly left on top of the overflowing bin. This would provide a comparison sample. She also discreetly swabbed the public park bench Karen often sat on and the handle of the community gate Karen touched daily. Trace evidence, cross-contamination pathways. Karen was likely as careless with her own hygiene as she was with Lily's safety. Back in her ad hoc lab in the utility room, she carefully packaged and labeled everything. She wouldn't send these to just a private lab friend, as she might vaguely tell Mark if he asked. These samples were going directly to a trusted colleague in a CDC-affiliated reference laboratory, expedited under a discreet research code name she maintained for just such independent, urgent analyses. The request would be for full pathogen screening and, crucially, DNA sequencing and comparison between the notebook samples and the control feces from Karen's dog. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across her quiet suburban street, Elena felt a shift within her. The frustration and helplessness were receding, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Karen Henderson wanted to teach Lily about the real world. Elena Rostova was about to give Karen Henderson a very real, very unforgettable lesson in biological accountability. The rules of this game were about to change dramatically. Karen was operating in a world of gossip and HOA bylaws. Elena was about to bring the full, unrelenting force of scientific evidence and federal biohazard protocols to bear. The waiting period for the lab results was excruciating each day, stretching an eternity. Elena threw herself into her official CDC work, remotely coordinating a response to a nasty norovirus outbreak at a cruise ship terminal, the clinical precision of her job, a strange counterpoint to the messy, emotional turmoil of her home life. Lily, meanwhile, was slowly, painstakingly beginning to engage with Dr. Ramirez again, talking about the bad book and the mean lady. Mark did his best to maintain a semblance of normalcy, his quiet anger, a steady simmering presence beneath his supportive exterior. Karen Henderson, oblivious, continued her reign. She successfully pushed through the new playground rules at an emergency HOA meeting, effectively barring Lily from her favorite slide unless she could demonstrate appropriate non-disruptive play behavior, a vague and subjective standard clearly designed for discriminatory enforcement. She also sent another violation notice, this time for the unapproved color of the welcome mat on Elena's front porch. It was petty, it was vindictive, and it was another nail in Karen's coffin as far as Elena was concerned. Each act was meticulously documented. Then the email arrived. Encrypted, flagged, urgent. Subject: Project Nightingale Bloom. Preliminary report. Elena's heart leaped. Nightingale Bloom was the code name for her analysis. She excused herself, went to her office, and sealed the door. The report was concise, clinical, and utterly damning. The swabs from Lily's notebook were positive for significant levels of Escherichia coli and Campylobacter jejuni, both common canine pathogens capable of causing severe gastrointestinal illness in humans, especially children. More importantly, the DNA sequencing showed a definitive match. The fecal material on the notebook was unequivocally from the same canine source as the control sample Elena had retrieved from Karen Henderson's dog waste. The chain of evidence was complete, scientifically irrefutable. A cold smile touched Elena's lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of grim, righteous certainty. She had her weapon. The climax was not a spontaneous outburst, but a carefully orchestrated surgical strike. Elena spent the next 2 days preparing. She compiled her findings into a formal report, complete with photographic evidence, the lab analysis chain of custody documentation, and a detailed risk assessment of the biohazardous exposure to a minor. She wrote it not as Lena Rostova, angry mother, but as Dr. Elena Rostova, CDC Biohazard Response Lead, using the precise, dispassionate language of her profession. She also made a series of calls. The first was to the state's Child Protective Services, lodging a formal complaint of child abuse and endangerment due to deliberate exposure to hazardous biological materials, attaching her preliminary report. The second was to the State Department of Health, reporting a public health code violation and a potential source of communicable disease. The third, through secured channels, was to a contact within the FBI's little-known Domestic Biohazard Countermeasures Unit, a unit she had liaised with on several occasions. While this incident was small-scale, the deliberate use of biological material to assault a child, especially one with known vulnerabilities, bordered on their area of concern. She wasn't asking for a federal takeover, not yet, but she was putting them on notice, providing information. The final piece of her plan involved the upcoming Maple Creek Preserve annual community picnic and HOA elections, an event Karen Henderson was chairing, an event designed to showcase her leadership and secure her re-election as president. It was Karen's stage, her moment of triumph. Elena intended to make it her downfall. The day of the picnic dawned bright and sunny. The community park, the scene of the original crime, was festooned with balloons and streamers. Karen Henderson, beaming in a crisp linen dress, flitted amongst the tables, exuding charm and authority. Lily, at her own insistence, was there clutching Mark's hand, her small face determined. Dr. Ramirez had said it might be empowering for her to witness some form of resolution from a safe distance. Elena had agreed, though her heart ached at Lily's bravery. The moment came after the hot dog eating contest, and before Karen was about to give her re-election speech. Elena, dressed not in her usual casual mom wear, but in a sharply tailored dark suit that subtly emphasized authority, stepped forward and requested permission to address the community. Karen, surprised, but clearly not expecting trouble from the overly sensitive Mrs. Rostova, magnanimously agreed, a smirk playing on her lips. Of course, Lena. We're all about community input here at Maple Creek. Elena walked to the small makeshift podium, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. Curious, indifferent, a few openly hostile Karen's cronies, and some like Mrs. Albright, quietly supportive. Her voice, when she spoke, was amplified by the small PA system, clear, calm, and utterly devoid of tremor. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Elena Rostova. Many of you know me as Lily's mother. She paused, her eyes finding Karen's. A few weeks ago, my daughter Lily was the victim of an assault in this very park, a disgusting act where animal feces were deliberately smeared on her personal therapy equipment by an adult member of this community. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile froze. The individual responsible, Elena, continued, her voice gaining strength, claimed her intention was to toughen Lily up. She dismissed the act as harmless as just a bit of dog dirt. Karen started to rise, her face flushing. Now see here, this is hardly the time or place for... Elena held up a hand, silencing her. This was not just dirt, Karen. The substance you used was teeming with pathogenic bacteria, including E. coli and Campylobacter. It was, in fact, a biohazard. And I have the scientific proof. She held up a slim-bound report. This report contains laboratory analysis confirming the pathogens and DNA sequencing that irrefutably matches the feces on my daughter's book to feces from your dog, Fido. Gasps. Karen's face went from red to a ghastly white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. You see, Elena's voice dropped, becoming icily precise. While you know me as Lena Rostova, your neighbor, my professional identity is somewhat different. I am Dr. Elena Rostova, and I am the lead investigator for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Biohazard Emergency Response Program. My entire career is dedicated to identifying, containing, and neutralizing biological threats. The silence in the park was absolute, save for the distant chirp of a bird. Every eye was fixed on Elena then, on the crumbling figure of Karen Henderson. What you did? Karen Elena concluded, her voice ringing with the full weight of her authority, was not a misguided attempt at discipline. It was biohazardous assault. It was an act of child abuse using a biological agent. And it has consequences. As if on cue, two vehicles turned into the park entrance, not the local police cruiser. One was a van from Child Protective Services. The other was a specialized unit from the State Health Department's Enforcement Division, accompanied by uniformed officers from a county-level task force that dealt with hazardous materials and public endangerment. A unit Elena's call to the DOH had activated. Karen Henderson looked wildly around, trapped. Her eyes met Elena's, and for the first time, Elena saw not arrogance or malice, but raw, unadulterated terror. The kind of terror Elena had seen in the eyes of people facing something they could not comprehend, could not fight, could not escape. The officials approached Karen, their expressions grim and professional. They spoke to her in low tones, but the import was clear. She was being taken into custody. The picnic, Karen's triumphant stage, had become the scene of her public, irrefutable disgrace. Lily, watching from the safety of Mark's arms, let out a small, shaky breath, then buried her face in his shoulder, not in fear this time, but in what looked like an overwhelming wave of relief. The falling action began with Karen Henderson's swift and ignominious removal from the community picnic, leaving behind a stunned and silent crowd. The legal proceedings that followed were for Elena a grimly satisfying validation of her efforts. The scientific evidence was irrefutable. The DNA matched the pathogen analysis, Elena's expert testimony on the risks of biohazardous exposure to children. It painted a damning picture. Karen's attempts to portray herself as a well-meaning but misunderstood community volunteer trying to instill toughness were shredded by the prosecution, who highlighted the deliberateness of her actions, her subsequent campaign of harassment, and her profound lack of remorse until faced with undeniable proof. The charge of aggravated child abuse involving a biological agent was a serious felony, and the court made an example of her. Karen Henderson was convicted and received a significant sentence, a period of incarceration, followed by lengthy probation with mandatory psychological counseling and a permanent restraining order, preventing her from ever contacting Lily or her family again. Her assets were also targeted, with a substantial portion awarded to Lily in a civil suit for emotional distress and therapy costs. Fido Karen's Bichon was removed from her care and rehomed with a loving family through a local animal shelter, a small but symbolic act of severing Karen from any further means of causing harm. For Lily, the healing journey was long and arduous, but she was a resilient child. With the unwavering support of Elena, Mark, and Dr. Ramirez, she slowly began to reclaim her world. She designed a new sensory notebook, this one with a cover she painted herself, a vibrant phoenix rising from multicolored flames. She started venturing back into the park, at first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. The community, shocked into awareness by Karen's downfall, rallied around her. Neighbors who had been swayed by Karen's rhetoric or who had remained silent out of fear offered apologies, gestures of kindness, and genuine support. The Maple Creek Preserve HOA was summarily disbanded by a vote of no confidence from the residents, replaced by a far more informal and compassionate neighborhood association, focused on mutual support rather than punitive enforcement. Mrs. Albright, a retired botanist, started a small sensory garden in a corner of the park filled with plants of different textures, colors, and scents, dedicating it to Lily and all children who experienced the world a little differently. It became a beloved spot, a quiet haven. Elena, for her part, found a new, if somewhat reluctant, status in Maple Creek. Her revelation as a CDC Biohazard Lead had initially caused a stir, a mixture of awe and intimidation. But as the dust settled, what remained was respect and a profound gratitude. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she had used her unique skills to protect her child and her community from an insidious threat. She continued her vital work at the CDC, the demands of her job, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between order and chaos, health and hazard. But now there was a subtle shift in how she moved through her neighborhood. She was still Lena Lily's mom, but she was also Dr. Rostova, a quiet guardian, a woman who understood the unseen dangers and possessed the extraordinary ability to confront them. The resolution was not just the punishment of a bully or the end of a reign of petty terror. It was in Lily's rediscovered laughter, echoing through the park as she played on her swing, the one that now stood proudly in their yard, without fear of violation. It was in the newfound warmth and understanding between neighbors, a community that had learned a hard lesson about empathy and the courage to stand up against cruelty. It was in Elena's quiet satisfaction, knowing she had used her formidable knowledge not just to combat global pandemics, but to defend the sanctity of her own child's small, precious world. The air in Maple Creek still carried the scent of lilacs and cut grass, but now it was also infused with something more, the fragrance of healing, of justice served, and of a peace that had been hard won but was all the more cherished for it.